Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs, Chapter 2, Boston Common. Continuous memory began for Louisa, so it seemed, with that breathless moment of struggling in the frog pond. It might very easily have been her last experience. It has turned out to be the first in that chain of recollection which makes up the record of a lifetime. It was a moment which she was never to forget, the choking, the sinking, and the sudden apparition of a face above her, a totally strange dark face, accompanied by the clutch of strong arms. A minute later, an adventurous Louisa was gasping upon the bank, safe and unharmed, save for the quarts of frog pond water which she had swallowed. A young Negro boy had seen the mischance and had sped to the rescue. Quicker than any of the horrified onlookers, he plunged in, brought Louisa safe to shore, and, it must be, slipped away without waiting to be thanked, or to give his name. Although she spoke of her rescuer many times in later life, Louisa never knew what to call him. But there had come to her very early proof of the humble kindness of the Negro race, that people over whom America's greatest internal quarrel was slowly waxing more fierce and deadly. Neither Louisa nor the colored lad, however, had much knowledge of the seriousness of that matter, as they smiled at each other in cheerful, youthful understanding, and went their own ways. Other adventures she had, myriads of them, during those early years in Boston, for the crooked streets were full of sunshine, or of beckoning east winds, and it was her impulse to follow wherever desire led her. Very slowly, however, she learned that such escapades were unbearably hard upon her busy mother, and that there was a certain element of wickedness in the pleasant act of straying out into the world and forgetting to come home. She tried very hard not to be wicked, did Louisa, but not always with success. Once she put down a list of faults, making it so painstakingly complete that the last item was love of cats. She had inherited a stiff conscience from her New England kindred. Suddenly, to her blinking astonishment, she found that she was no longer officially the baby, but that there was another round little girl in her mother's arms, Elizabeth, named for the devoted Miss Peabody. It was time for Louisa to learn to take care of herself. She was well able to, when once she set her mind upon it. Her memories of that period had much to do with spring breezes, grass on the common, passing butterflies and friendly cats and puppies. All of her recollections were beginning to be clear, and all of a piece, but she was still quite unconscious of the larger things that were going on above her head in the Alcott household. People came and went, people who were later to become distinguished in every walk of life, but she knew little of them. Many important persons came to visit the Temple School, which was, for a time, really famous. She liked to be taken there. She enjoyed the beauty of its tinted walls, the casts of splendid faces, the wonderful copy of Pilgrim's Progress, sent from England, which lay in state upon the table. The children of the school, her sister Anna among them, were all a little older than she. They looked rather condescendingly upon the small, rowdy Louisa, who did not yet know about sitting quietly in the attentive circle before the teacher, and about hearing such unexpected talk as a description of how the spirit should unfold, and what was a child's first duty to himself. Kind, capable Miss Peabody would sit by, putting down notes of all that happened every day, although she did not record Louisa's untutored interruptions and her bursts of laughter when something had happened to tickle her alert fancy. Sometimes she would be hushed quickly into respectful silence when the august visitors came in. The Temple School was talked of everywhere and attracted the attention of all who were interested in education, or of travelers from abroad who were being shown the sights of Boston. She saw arrive one day a tall, thin, slightly ungainly man, with such an expression upon his face of serene, radiant kindness that even she was warmed by its sunshine. She was told, though it scarcely caught her straying attention as she played on the floor among the legs of the guests whom he had brought, that this was Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was inviting her father to come visit his home in Concord. "You would like Concord," he was saying to Bronson Alcott, who apparently had never been there. Louisa was further introduced for the first time to members of her own family, who had so far been only names to her. She saw her grandfather, Colonel Joseph May, a forbidding, somewhat irascible, but unendingly generous old gentleman who had firm views about children and how good and quiet and well-behaved they should be. Louisa's boisterous energy did not always seem to please him completely, but as he frowned down upon her noisiness from his great dignity of height, she understood as well as he did that behind the appearance of disapproval was a warm and proud affection for all of his little granddaughters. She saw her uncle, Samuel Joseph May, the gentle, true-hearted brother of Abba Alcott. He had known and loved Bronson, Alcott even before she had, and all of his life stood by these two throughout their changing adventures. She saw dear cousin Lizzie Wells, a niece of her mother's, pink-cheeked, pretty even in the eyes of a small child, who thought that she must be very old. She was prettier still in later years when the pink cheeks were still pink and the hair had turned white, while her staunch friendship for the storm-tossed Alcotts had remained undimmed through all the years. It is not quite plain whether Louisa ever really saw the tremendously important Aunt Hancock, who was such a very old lady by the time even Abba and Bronson were married. She became a family legend, with a story of her often in request and often told by Bronson to his children. It was called How I Went to Dinner with Aunt Hancock. She was a great aunt of Abba Meigs, this Madame Dorothy Quincy Scott, and she did not go by any such informal title as made use of her first name. Not Aunt Dorothy, perish the idea, nor Aunt Scott, but Aunt Hancock, from the name of her famous first husband. She had married, when very young, the John Hancock whose bold signature leads the list of signers of the Declaration of Independence. She was a bride when the Revolution was breaking out, and was mistress of the Executive Mansion when her husband became the first governor of Massachusetts. A picturesque gentleman he was, courageous, extravagant, patriotic, and formidable, a man of great presence, coming to preside over the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention in a crimson velvet suit and plumed hat, setting the first strong hand to the management of a new and turbulent Commonwealth. Dorothy was a spirited wife and upheld the grandeur of her position in good part. The trials and troubles of her launching a new country were not long over. The trials and troubles of launching a new country were not long over when John Hancock died. His wife married again, but within the family, at least, the name of James Scott never seemed to eclipse the first title, and she was always Aunt Hancock. She lived to a great age and was the grand figure of the whole family relationship. When it was reported that her niece, Abba May, was engaged to marry a schoolmaster, she issued an impressive summons that the young man should be brought to dine with her. She liked to be kind, but to be so in a splendid and autocratic manner. Joyous yet perfectly respectful was Bronson's description of how she received them, in great state, sitting in her big chair as though it were a throne. She entertained them with reminiscences of her great days when she was the governor's lady on Beacon Hill, and dropped hints to Bronson that he should be properly impressed with the nature of the grand alliance he was about to make. As they went out to dinner, she rated the servants for being slow. She announced that she always began dinner with pudding, since she did not like the foolish new fashion of pudding at the end. She carved the great round beef herself because Governor Hancock's wrist was lame, and she had fallen into the habit of carving while at the mansion. Bronson understood her fully, saw her kindness and sincerity under the abruptness of her imperious manner, dared to differ with her when she issued one ultimatum after another, and, after a final flurry of argument, got up to go, high in the old lady's favor. About his departure to meet the appointment at his Sunday school, she was rather irascible, and said that the children might all go to old Nick before she would allow her dinner to be interrupted. But she finally dismissed him with a forgiving farewell. As has been said, she was of the May connection, and she had well upheld the family, saying that the Mays are peppery. She was high in the 90s even at this time, so that it must be that she had died before the Alcotts returned to Boston. Nonetheless, she figures in Louisa's history again. Louisa and her mother used to exchange glances when the household maxim concerning the Mays was repeated. They had both inherited the excitable May temper. The woman schooled to self-control by the necessities of life, and the little girl, earnestly trying to learn to curb her own impetuous indignations, used to consult together as to how each should solve the same problem. Cheerful Anna and shy, quiet Elizabeth were, like the unruffled Alcotts, but Louisa and her mother remained inflammable Mays to the very end. Time passed, and to Louisa it was a complete mystery how it happened that, all at once, the family was packing its possessions again, and was going to live in Concord. She understood, very vaguely first, that there had been cruel sorrow in that gay little household, that her mother's heart had been wrung with pain over the baby brother who had come and went away again. Abba Alcott had, at certain times, a will of iron to hold in her feelings. Only long after, when her daughter saw some of her mother's letters and read in her journal the despairing cry of bitter grief, did Louisa have any real knowledge of what her mother had suffered over the little boy who was lost, and of whom the girls were taught to speak as though they had really had and known their brother. Elizabeth continued to be the baby of the family, a gentle, cheerful soul, putting to shame the stormy, never-quiet Louisa, who found it so hard to be obedient. None of the little girls could know how the Temple School was hailed at first with approval and enthusiasm on every side, and then criticized and condemned until it declined slowly to its final fall. 5 years it continued, from the time that Louisa was 2 years old until she was 7. She was old enough then to understand something of what abolition was, the great question of the time. She heard with uncomprehending excitement how her father's great friend, William Lloyd Garrison, was dragged through the streets with a noose around his neck by the mob which wanted to hang him because of his declarations that the slaves must be set free. She could not realize, however, that people were whispering amongst themselves how unfit it was that an abolitionist should be teaching their children. She could see, when she visited the school, that the numbers had dwindled. She noticed, finally, the little colored girl, whom Bronson Alcott had included amongst the pupils. She was not there on the heartbreaking day when Bronson, deaf to all protests and still insisting that the school must be open to all children alike, saw the indignant parents come in one after another and take their children away. The Temple School was closed. Bronson Alcott never had the heart to attempt the founding of another. All of a sudden, as has been said, the family was moving to Concord with, in Louisa's mind, a vague impression of Mr. Emerson's presiding over the enterprise as its patron and guiding saint. The Hosmer cottage, as it is still called, stood at the edge of a broad estate, and had a large garden with fields behind it. The river, flowing through flat meadows, was within easy reach of those short, vigorous legs, which had found Boston Common much too narrow. Louisa raced like a colt over the slopes, for not since they had left Pennsylvania had she known the freedom of open country. There was a keenness in the wind and a smell of pine woods which she had not known at Germantown. There were no luxuriant stately gardens here, with the warm rose-scented delights of Wick, but there were the familiar daisies and mayflowers, and there was the same glorious pink mountain laurel in the nearby hills, which the older country people spoke of as Calico Bush. Bronson worked hard at anything he could find to do in an effort to support his household. He toiled at farm labor, at gardening, at wood chopping. Most of the people whom he knew owned land, worked on it to a certain extent themselves, and were glad of such help as they got from Bronson Alcott. He knew a great deal about farming. He was interesting to work with, for he was always, so tradition universally agrees, extraordinarily good company. Numbers of people had their own woodlots, where was cut every year their store of winter fuel. Bronson Alcott cut for other people and received in return the privilege of getting his own wood for the cold weather. We can picture, instead of the expeditions along the Wissahickon, the 3 little girls going with him into the tall, silent pine groves, playing amongst the dry brown needles, finding Indian pipes and jewel-dotted toadstools, or, tired with vigorous running back and forth, sitting down to watch the white, sweet-smelling chips fly from beneath the steadily swinging axe. They talked gravely of everything they had seen and heard. The school philosopher, father, the eagerly inquiring Anna, small, gentle Betty, and ever-curious Louisa. Their mother was not apt to go with them, for there was a new baby in the cottage now, May, the smallest Alcott of all. Much of the time, the older 3 were taken care of by their father when their mother was busy, or when she frankly admitted she was too tired to be wise or patient with them. Abba was a person of varying moods, excitable, quickly moved, always devoted to them all, but often too harrowingly uneasy concerning the family welfare to be entirely calm. It was Bronson who taught them their letters by a strange series of gymnastics on the parlor floor. I was represented by a tall, prim, dignified pose, combined with strutting proudly across the room. X by spreading the arms and legs all abroad, and S by a fearful contortion supposed to imitate the neck of a goose, accompanied by a goose's hissing. Life was extremely bare in that little house, where they had not even the luxury of a stove and cooked before the fireplace. It was full of gay spirits, however, flooded by a never-ceasing stream of affectionate family jokes. They were all of them generous to the utmost degree, so that it was by Abba Alcott's consent, as well as by Bronson's, and the three girls, that they habitually gave away everything that could or could not be spared. A friend of theirs, coming to stay for a visit, observed that their extremely plain and meager meals were reduced from 3 a day to 2, since they were carrying the third daily to a family in great need. Everyone lived simply then. The Alcotts lived rather more simply than the others, although they would have been the last to consider that they were very poor or to feel sorry for themselves on any such account. Life in Germantown among the Quakers had already made it clear to them that simple living was no hardship. One of the diversions of this time was the weekly pillow fight which the children were allowed to have just before they went to bed. These battles, which it was understood were never to become so furious as to endanger life and limb, were an institution which lasted for many years, part of the Alcott tradition, to have a good time no matter what dangers threatened. The children leaped and ran about in their nightgowns. How a good suit of pajamas would have lent itself to the occasion, and finally subsided, breathless and rosy, ready to say their prayers to their father or mother, and drop immediately to sleep. Louisa, on a certain thrilling occasion, received an invitation to go on a visit to Providence, all by herself, unaccompanied by supervising parents. Abba Alcott must have had some misgivings over sending such a lively little girl to stay with kind but unsuspecting elders. She evidently concluded finally that both sides might learn something from the experience, and she let Louisa go. There were no other children in the house, but nonetheless young Louisa had a glorious time for a few days, playing with the pet animals, inspecting the spice mill, and being made much of by everyone in the family. Small as she was, she did observe that the grown-up members of the household began to seem a little worn, while she herself became suddenly desperately bored and very homesick. She was finally left to her own devices, with the inevitable result that she got into trouble. In a very short time, she found some dirty children who seemed to her ideal playmates, after the stiff adult companions who had been trying so hard to amuse her. She played with her new friends for a long time in the barn. Finding that they were poorly fed and hungry, she ran in haste to the pantry, by chance unguarded at the moment, and helped herself to figs for them and cakes. She made several journeys back and forth, and then suddenly was discovered. Her exhausted hostess could endure no more, and gave Louisa a tremendous scolding and sent her up to the attic to think over her outrageous behavior. Poor little Louisa! She had not the faintest idea that in feeding the poor she was doing anything other than what was right. They always fed the poor at her house, no matter how little there was with which to feed anybody. She sat in a trunk, not crying, but thinking dark, hard thoughts, furious with anger, bewildered, ashamed, knowing that she was disgraced, but not understanding why. "She meant it kindly, so I wouldn't mind, Fanny," she heard a voice say outside the door. There came in one of the young men of the family, Christopher, who had been so good to her ever since she came. He said a very little in brief explanation to make Louisa see that she had done wrong in taking things without permission, and then he held her on his knee, while she leaned her face against his shoulder and broke into a storm of weeping. He did not make stupid attempts to comfort her, but let her cry her fill until, in sheer exhaustion, she went to sleep. She awoke an hour afterward, frightened for an instant to find herself in the twilight of the big garret, then reassured to discover that she was still upon his knee, within the circle of his comforting arms. He took her downstairs, where everything was cheerful, and explained, and a promise was given that the family in Concord need not be told until Louisa herself should give an account of the affair. That good, wise Christopher she remembered long, with infinite gratitude. At home in Concord, she spent much time playing with a boy named Cy, his last name lost to history. He was always leading her into the most complicated scrapes, and she was always willing to be led. He had only to whisper into her ear, "You daresn't do that," for her to become fired with the feeling that she must do it or die. She jumped off a high beam in his barn and was borne home on a board with both ankles badly sprained. He got her to rub red peppers into her eyes to see how it felt. He had to guide her home howling, since little girls with red peppers in their eyes cannot see and are forced to roar with pain. The first winter passed, and with the spring there arrived a new plan. The girl's father, it seemed, was going to England. People there had understood Bronson's ideas on education, had named a school after him, and invited him to come and see it. There was a bustle of preparation. Anna and Louisa, being at last old enough to help. Bronson Alcott was the sort of man who never knew where his socks were, or even his money, but was only conscious of where his books were to be found. Mr. Emerson seemed to have done something to make this possible also. He and Abba both knew that the journey and the acclaim of those who believed in him would comfort Bronson after the bitter disappointment concerning the temple school. Whatever was Bronson Alcott's dream of what was to result from the journey to England is not quite certain, but it is clear that the hopes of all of them were soaring high when he sailed away and left such emptiness in the little household remaining behind. It was the girl's mother who taught them now, and who read them from Dickens and from the shabby old Pilgrim's Progress which their father loved so much. The big, beautiful copy had been sold, with everything else belonging to the temple school, to pay a part of its debts. The rest of the indebtedness still hung like a cloud over the little family. 4 children and no income make a terrifying problem for a young mother to face. Abba Alcott attacked it bravely, but even the 2 older girls were beginning to understand that things were in a perilous state. They looked forward as intently as she did to the day when their father should come home. Surely this journey was going to open some new chance for work and make things easier and safer for them all. His letters were interesting and stimulating, even to the children. He had met Robert Owen, the leader of a new movement. He met Thomas Carlyle, the most eminent man of his day in England, looked up to as a great writer and great thinker. Carlyle did not believe in the changes which Robert Owen and Bronson Alcott were advocating, and Bronson quarreled with him. That was something of an event, for mild Bronson quarreled with very few in all the course of his life. It was a great moment when, toward the end of the summer, the girls heard that their father was coming home. It would be in a month now, then a week. Then it was the actual day. Their vague, bright hopes would have some fulfillment at last. Anna and Louisa still did not know what it was that they looked for. They did not observe that as the days of waiting passed, their mother was looking even more anxious than ever. They were watching at the door for their father. There was a stir of arrival. He was there, but they had not been prepared for this. With him were 2 other men, and a boy, a lad bigger than Anna, staring at them as awkwardly as they stared in return. This was Mr. Charles Lane, they were told. The boy was William Lane, the other man, Mr. Henry Wright, all from England. Very slowly, it began to be plain to them. Then new arrivals were to live with them in the cottage, for the winter at least. When the spring came, they were all to move again. They were to begin a new life, absolutely different from anything they had known, or that anybody had ever tried before. Louisa was 10 now, and Anna 11. They were quite large enough to take in the excitement, the wonder, and also a few of the misgivings that went with this dazzling plan. They could see their mother's face clouded with the thought of how the family was to live. 5 children and 4 elders, a total of 9, in a small house, large enough, really only 3 or 4. There had been so little money for food before. How could it be enough now? The girls understood this as well as she, but just as she did, they loved their father and wanted above everything else to see him happy. They could not interrupt his delighted talk about the new plan for transcendentalism, the life of which honesty, sincerity, and unselfishness and all things of the spirit were to be the rule instead of things of the body. The girls did not understand it very well. They half knew that their mother did not believe in it, but, like her, they would follow anywhere that their beloved father chose to lead. It was a hard winter. The Englishmen were welcomed in Concord, while people talked everywhere of the new plan. Bronson went about in a delighted dream of hopefulness. Abba made little comment, but taught the girls how to help her more and more at tasks at which they brought all the willingness of devoted love. Louisa was not fond of housework and cooking, of helping with the washing, of carrying the water pitchers and sweeping behind the doors. She was impatient and rebellious, and in fact much too young for any such hard labor, but she did it all without much need of being urged, for she was bound that her mother should not be too heavily burdened. Anna was quicker and more skillful and managed her work much more easily. She had a natural gift for household accomplishments, where Louisa had only clumsy energy and an unbounded generosity for doing her part. They had lessons every day with their father. Even though their food was not much more than fruit, vegetables, and grain porridge, it was hard to supply that household. Abba was adamant on one subject. The rapidly growing children should have milk enough to make them strong, and there should be fuel sufficient to keep them decently warm. A baby could not stand the harsh winters of New England without some tender care. There are several versions of the tale about the load of wood. Perhaps, indeed, there were several such episodes. This is one, at least, of the stories that are told. There was one night when a windy snow was flying about the little house, and the cold was creeping in at every drafty crack. There was practically no wood in the shed, and Abba was frantic. Suddenly, quite unannounced, a load of wood arrived, sent by a kindly neighbor out of his own store, got in his own woodlot, perhaps even cut by Bronson himself. The Alcott's friends had all been anxious over the state of affairs at Hosmer Cottage, and each wanted to do something to help. It was surely a godsend, and rejoiced Abba's anxious heart for a few hours. Later in the evening, with cold and dark and wind still surrounding them, Bronson came in, smiling delightedly. A very poor man had just come to him, telling of a cold house, a sick baby, and an empty shed with no fuel. It was so fortunate that they had wood to give him, Bronson told his wife. He had let the poor fellow take all that he needed and had helped him to wheel it home. But what of his own family? Abba returned hotly this time, for in spite of her unflinching affection, she was not possessed of inexhaustible patience. The Alcotts had a baby too, she reminded him. It was just as cold in their house, and would be dangerously so before morning. Her approaches were interrupted by a knock at the door. A second neighbor, not knowing what the first had done, had also sent them a load of wood. The fire was piled high again, and warmth and cheerfulness filled the house once more. I told you that we would not suffer, Bronson reminded Abba. It was his sure belief that God would always provide for those who loved him. Abba believed it also, with a difference. She thought that God expected people to help themselves as far as they could, and not to lay the whole burden upon him. Through all their lives, Anna and her father tended to accept the first trusting belief. Louisa and her mother the greater responsibility of the second. It made no rift between them, but it shaped their destinies to the end. Spring came at last. A place had been found near Harvard, Massachusetts, not far from the towns of Ayer and Groton, where a hillside farm and an old empty farmhouse could be acquired as the home of the great experiment. It was a dilapidated dwelling with a huge chimney in the very middle of it, standing on a slope that gave, from the doorway, a broad and inspiring sweep of view. The house had been empty for some years. The steep acres had not lately been tilled, but all that, so Bronson and his comrades asserted, would soon be changed into a green paradise, where peace and happiness and brotherly companionship should make every task easy. It was June when the final move came about. The flowers were blooming in the cottage garden, and the fields about it were strewn with the white of daisies. Abba, going from room to room over the task of once more packing their possessions, looked all about the place, which had been home even longer than the little paradise of Germantown. She must leave it, and she was ready to go, for she loved Bronson more than she loved mere places of comparative peace and comfort. The four little girls were wild with excitement, and were not much assistance in gathering up the clothes, the blankets, the cooking utensils, the books, and the busts of philosophers, each as necessary as the other in equipping the new venture. It was raining as they drove away in the little covered wagon with its single horse. All day they traveled, jolting and laborious, over rutty roads, up cedar-grown hills, down into bushy little valleys. For most of the journey of 20 miles, the rain came down upon them in torrents. It did not quench the hopeful spirits of the philosophers, or the wild excitement of the children. Abba, with the yellow-haired May in her arms, must have let her mind go back many times to the safe white cottage and the friendly, clustered houses of Concord, but Louisa and her father did no such thing. The thoughts of both of them were traveling far ahead of the toiling wagon, roaming farther and farther afield in that broad new world. They were all, however, drooping with weariness as they came toiling up the last climb over the deep line of wheel tracks, for the house did not stand near any highway. The storm was clearing, leaving the whole valley of Nashua River visible, and the two mountains, Wachusett and Monadnock, looming through the receding rain. The old curled shingles of the big house were black with wet after the June shower, as were the trunks of the twisted ancient apple trees which grew about the dwelling. On account of the old trees and the new orchard which they intended to plant, Bronson and his companions had decided to call the place Fruitlands. And that's the end of chapter 2.